Please.
Okay.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me all right? Yep. Starting my speech in 3, 2. We all know that indigenous cultures have suffered the most. They suffered absolutely the most out of all people in the world, right? Colonizers have tried to eradicate their culture completely. They've tried to literally breed the culture out of them, as seen in Australia. And these indigenous cultures have ended up traumatized throughout the years because they've been robbed of their land, robbed of their culture, and people have quite literally tried to completely erase their culture off the face of the earth, right? We know that the relationship between indigenous people and the government is completely ruined for this reason. So therefore, we don't think it's fair to then tell these indigenous people and these indigenous cultures that their lifestyle and culture is being plastered onto like government videos and government like advertising photos to increase government money through tourism, right? So therefore, we believe that this we should oppose the promotion and marketing of indigenous cultures by governments for the purpose of tourism. Stand side affirming. So then what does the world look like when we actually do this, right? We believe that no cultures or indigenous cultures at all should be shown in tourism ads. So what will I do for you in this debate? Firstly, I'll bring you a point about the ethical principles between just in the history aspect of this entire debate. Secondly, who actually benefits when we use indigenous cultures in marketing tourism by governments, and my second speaker, Gabe, will bring you a split point about the entire reputation impacts. So in order to win this debate, we need to prove that ethically, it's just completely ethically and immorally wrong to profit off and use these indigenous cultures by using their photos in tourism ads. So that brings me to my first substantive point about how it's just horribly unethical. We think that it's just like morally wrong to take people who were robbed of their land and just of their entire culture. And when like Europeans invaded, when like Europeans and colonizers came in and completely like ruined their culture, just overall hurt them, we think it's just wrong to have these Europeans that invaded like North America, and especially like 90% of the population died, might I add, the indigenous population died in this situation. We just think it's unfair to have them use these like tourism photos and use these photos and stuff like that on tourism advertisements. So the government has, so what we actually saw when this happened, the government like actively set up camps in the past to destroy these cultures, like we talked about in Australia. They tried to completely get rid of these cultures. They were trying to colonize them, and these people were actually slaughtered in vast numbers, right? So what actually happens now when the government tries to use these people as like tourism advertisements? Well, 3 things happen. Firstly, it's just completely degrading to the people of this culture, right? We don't want like, you don't see like Jewish people, they don't want like Nazis walking into like their homes and stuff with cameras to say, oh, look, these are the Jewish people, this is how they live, after they've literally robbed them, hurt them, completely like destroyed their lifestyle. That's just completely degrading and disrespectful to these people overall. And it's not like, it's like no different for indigenous cultures, right? Because the government in the past has destroyed them. So then why would you want these indigenous cultures to then go and like forgive them? Like you wouldn't want these people, if you were an indigenous person, to come in and be like, smile for the camera, so then they can come take photos of you for their own personal tourism purposes, right? So we just see that it's like overall disrespectful, just to use them as like a money-making aspect, because they're not coming back for like cultural reparations or whatever. They're only coming back when this starts to make them profit, which is just completely degrading and disrespectful. And the second thing that happens is that indigenous people are still actually dealing with the effects of this colonization today, right? Today, we still see that these people are significantly poorer. They have less access to resources and like opportunities than other people. They just live in like overall lower socioeconomic neighborhoods. So the pain is still there. They're still traumatized, and they're still dealing with the trauma of the past. So it's just completely unfair and immorally wrong to come and show like the culture of these people and to come and like put it as an aesthetic, but don't actually show the past and the abuse and the trauma of that. And that brings me to the third mechanism in this point, where it's just overall completely degrading, not just to the people, but to the entire culture, to turn it into just an aesthetic, right? We don't want to invite people to come into the country and be like, hey, look at this like really, really beautiful culture, which might I remind you, like in the past, they tried to destroy and completely get rid of. And we don't want them to come and like show it off when this is like when they've completely tried to get rid of it in the future. This basically becomes how like zoos come and be like, oh, here, come look at our animals. Like, this is not what we want to turn indigenous people into. We want, why would you want to like show them off when you're still actively hurting them, you're still actively causing them to suffer, you're still bringing them trauma, and they're still dealing with the trauma of the past, right? We know that they're still trying to build like airports on Maori gravesites. If they're like actively hurting them, why would you want to be like, come look at this beautiful culture that we tried to actually destroy in the past, right? So what happens at the end of this point, we see that governments only like to reach out when it actually benefits themselves, right? They only reach out when it brings them money, and they wouldn't actually reach out and use and be like, come look at the culture of these indigenous people if it wasn't bringing them any revenue and any money in the tourism industry, which is why it's just ethically unjustified. And this brings me to my second point about who actually benefits from this entire movement. So we see that indigenous cultures are made up of like really, really small proportions of countries, right? We know that they just make up like really small proportions of the country. So the amount they actually receive from this tourism aspect, or the amount of money that they'll actually get from the revenue generated through tourism, is barely any. Barely any of this actually goes back into the indigenous community, right? So firstly, we see that the government often uses the money to go directly back into like bolsters, it bolsters the same institutions that they initially oppress them and that continue to oppress them, right? Like the airport example I gave, a lot of this tourism money, the revenue generated just goes back into the airport where this money, like where they built it on a Maori gravesite. So that's completely disrespectful as well. So it's just overall the same old system that put them in the low socioeconomic state in a lot of places. It's the same government that put them in the bad position in the first place that wants to come profit off these people. So that even if the negating house tries to tell us that, but like, oh, tourists come and they get to see like the years of oppression and the harms that actually happen to this community, right? And that the people get more educated. Well, we see that even though this happens, like how much of the money, like sure, people become more educated, but how much of this money actually goes back into helping these indigenous populations and these indigenous communities? I'll take a POI now if you have one.
Yeah, does promoting indigenous cultures not exclusively give governments an incentive to preserve and uplift these cultures in a way that benefits them?
Right, well, that's what you would think, right? But we see even in the world today, even recently, they've tried to build like airports on Maori grave sites. They try to tell us that they'll preserve their indigenous cultures, right? They try to make it look like they're so respectful towards them. But in fact, they go and take this revenue, they go and build like these grave sites, they go and completely exploit these cultures. And I'll actually get to that soon in my second mechanism, which is now that the indigenous cultures actually barely get any of this money, right? We see this in like they still face like the systematic and institutionalized racism, which often prevents them from succeeding in the real world, because the money that comes from this tourism doesn't actually go and help these indigenous cultures in reality, right? Because of this, we see that like populations of these poor people, they're just subject to exploitation. And so why are they poor? That's because they've just been oppressed by these governments, by these people who tried to strip them of their culture and the colonizers in the first place. So then what do these people actually have to do when they're poor, right? Well, they're subject to exploitation. We see that the American government right now puts people on like reservations. And what does this actually mean? This means that they're given land that the land that they're given, like they have their own sovereign land. But then because of this, like the governments don't actually help or support them. And for that reason, they're just completely like excluded from society. Because of this, they become poor and homeless. And right now we see that because of this, like they're just completely exploited in America right now. There's like casinos and private companies coming in to build casinos on these indigenous people's land. And they can't do anything about it because the government can't impose restrictions on this land. So then they have to take this money and they have to be completely exploited. So overall, they're just harmed in this entire case, which is why we are so, so proud to affirm.
With POIs, if you could just visually give a cue, so like wave or like put up a POI sign if you have one. Oh
my God.
Okay, wow.
Ours is
Oh wait, that makes ours look bad, but okay. Yeah, sweet as. Okay. Oh, sorry, just organizing my papers. We tell you when indigenous groups are used as a show and tell mechanism for governments to use to bring people into your country to generate good tourism. We tell you that A, that's an ethically morally wrong thing to do, and secondly, there's no actual tangible benefits for indigenous groups, regardless of what team negating will say in this debate. Two things I'm going to do to you in this debate. Firstly, I'm going to talk to you about the contentions in this debate that I've discovered, and secondly, I'm going to present to you my split, which is the economical and reputational impacts of using indigenous cultures for promotion and marketing. That split point will be incorporated into my second contention, which are the 2 points of clash in this debate. My first point of clash in this debate is who better protects indigenous groups, and secondly, who generates better tourism, both an ethically principled point and economical practical point, right? So let's go into the first point of clash in this debate, which is who better protects indigenous groups, right? We've got a couple of claims that negating has said in this debate, right? And we tell you that these claims are completely false. Firstly, we got the claim that they'd be able to preserve indigenous sites to generate revenue, and that way that would be able to protect indigenous groups, right? We tell you, we have 4 responses for this point, right? First of all, we tell you that this is blatant tokenism and doesn't actually benefit indigenous groups because of the fact that it's only being built to look pretty and not for the actual function of what indigenous groups do. Secondly, we tell you that doesn't actually address the root issues that indigenous people face. We tell you that indigenous people face systematic racism. We tell you that they face massive oppression in systems, and just by preserving indigenous sites, you don't actually get better protection of indigenous groups. Thirdly, we tell you that there are probably going to be a good amount of disrespectful tourists that go to those indigenous sites, regardless of what team negating will say, right? They tell us that they're going to have respectful groups of people going there to these indigenous sites because of the rules, but we tell you that not everyone follows the rules. You're going to have groups of disrespectful people regardless on both sides of the house, and we tell you that it's actually worse on their side of the house because more people are actually going to see these indigenous sites. They're going to see that these are vulnerable people that they can target and make fun of and just take a quick photo for the Instagram likes, right? We then tell you, fourthly, that this is not a mutually exclusive thing on their side of the house. We tell you that we can preserve indigenous sites on our side of the house as well, and this actually addresses the proper root issues because we're preserving it for the good reason on our side of the house, which is to address the root issues, which a team negating will not do because of the fact that they have to generate revenue, right? We on our side of the house don't want to preserve indigenous sites to generate revenue. We want to preserve these indigenous sites purely for the sole purpose of making sure that these indigenous groups are protected, right? Then we got another claim that because people visit these indigenous sites because they care, right? We tell you that this is quite a bit of an assertion on their side of the house because firstly, we tell you that a lot of people go to indigenous sites, indigenous sites because of the aesthetic, right? I told you this immediately. And secondly, we tell you that we actually get more people on our side of the house who visit these indigenous sites because they care, because of the fact that they discovered it on their own, not because of the fact that it was advertised, right? When you have people genuinely finding it out on their own and doing research, they are actually more likely to be respectful on our side of the house than it is on their side of the house, right? Then we got a third claim that there would be good interactions that are happening with indigenous groups. We tell you that this is not entirely true. We tell you, number one, there are going to be disrespectful interactions. I've already mechanized this in a couple of responses. Secondly, we tell you that what the governments will do in this to preserve indigenous sites or to get good interactions with indigenous groups is to glorify it, right? We tell you that governments are likely to sweep away all the negative stuff that have happened to these indigenous groups, such as colonization, as to generate revenue, as to get people to continue going there, as to make sure that when people are going there, they see the good of it, not the actual crux and all the bad stuff that's happened to it, right? And we tell you that this is particularly important because of the fact that A, you don't actually protect these indigenous groups, you hide away their suffering, and you don't actually address the root issues that they face, right? Then we were told that the government will actually face backlash if they exploit these indigenous sites. This is not necessarily true, as we already see that a lot of governments out there who have indigenous groups already exploit these indigenous groups, and they don't face a lot of backlash, right? We tell you that Canada does a poor job of protecting their Native Americans, yet no one actually genuinely cares about them. No one actually genuinely cares about them. We tell you that Auckland Airport was built on a Maori gravesite, yet no one is out here protesting about that. And so we tell you that governments don't actually face this backlash, right? Then lastly, we got the claim that you repress the knowledge, you repress the culture of indigenous groups when you don't use it for advertisement. We tell you that this is just a huge mischaracterization of our case. We tell you that we don't want to glorify and make an indigenous group look pretty just for the fact that we want to generate tourism. We tell you that the root issues actually need to be addressed on our side of the house, and we actually don't repress the culture. We actually acknowledge the history behind it and learn about it on our side of the house, whereas they, on their side of the house, they only preserve it to make it look pretty, right? So we tell you that we win that contention in this debate so far. I'll take a POI now if you have one.
Is it not so much better to have at least a little bit of representation, even if it's slightly like misrepresentative, than none at all?
See, when you misrepresent a culture, you essentially make it look like something that it's not, right? As if you imagine the LGBTQ community, right? Would they want to be misrepresented as James Charles? Of course not. That guy's a pedophile, right? You don't want people thinking that the entire LGBTQ community is James Charles, right? So misrepresentation is not good representation. And if the gating team is claiming that misrepresentation is good because you get a little exposure, we tell you that that is completely false and completely harmful to those indigenous groups. Then we go to the second contention in this debate, which is who better generates better tourism, right? And this is both ethically and economically, right? We tell you that we were told that immediately at first neg that you get more people and more people pay money when they visit these indigenous sites because indigenous groups are able to sell products and are able to go to the sites and make money off of their tourists, right? We tell you that this is ethically wrong to sell out your culture in order to make a little bit of profit. But even so, they don't actually get good economic impacts because the people who are actually going to visit this place are actually genuinely interested in the indigenous groups. They're likely to stay in the cities where indigenous groups don't actually exist. So therefore, there's no actual revenue that's going towards indigenous groups. We also already gave you this case at first F and is completely unresponded to by first neg, right? So then what does it look like on our side of the house? And this goes into my split, right? We tell you that the countries that do have indigenous cultures look like New Zealand with the Maori people, Australia with the indigenous Australians, and we tell you Canada and United States with the Native Americans, right? We tell you that already at first F, that there are colonized countries who attempted to eradicate them and that there's a huge amount of pain and suffering that comes with their history, right? We tell you that when we happen to use this as a promotional site and a way to market those countries, we tell you that there are two negative impacts specifically. One, we tell you that there's blatant tokenism and you get pushback from the citizens in the country because you're actively showing them off in order to generate copies, right? We tell you that a lot of root issues aren't going to be addressed on their side of the house, and that's why citizens are going to get angry, and that's why the reputation of New Zealand is going to fall. And we tell you, because of these following reasons, side with side affirming.
I'll take POIs and chapters, but I'll probably ask one. Oh yeah, that too. I'll do that as well. Yeah, very nice. I think what the negating side has suffered from is an extreme lack of comparison, right? Because when they set up the debate to be about governments who care so little about their Indigenous people that they would sweep all of their issues under the rug, or they would so heavily misrepresent them, then that proves that there's probably no incentive to care about their Indigenous cultures at all. And what that means is that under their comparison is that you're probably getting no money or no sort of funding to them anyway. You're probably not preserving their culture in the slightest, and you're probably not taking any steps to help them at all. I think even so far as you prove that it probably wasn't the most authentic version of their culture under our side of the house, it's still going to be so much better because they tell you that governments exist that do not care about their Indigenous people, and that was always going to be so much worse when you have absolutely no exposure to them when there's tourists and you aren't able to feed back any money or any culture. That was debate losing for them. 4 things I'm going to do in today's speech. Firstly, I'm going to address whether this is ethically justified. Secondly, who better protects these Indigenous groups. Thirdly, I'm going to flip some of the material about cultural appropriation to be a gain for us. And then lastly, whether the money gets back to these cultures. Okay. Is it ethically justified? 2 sort of umbrellas here. Firstly, on the fact that it was degrading and disrespectful, and secondly, that it was about the aesthetic. Right. On degrading and disrespectfulness, here's why it's probably going to always be respectful, right? We told you firstly, and this was already told you, we already told you at Lily, that we've got rules and regulations in these sacred places that that preserve the respect of their culture. They told you that the people aren't just going to obey them, but I'll tell you that you literally get kicked out if you aren't wearing long pants to certain temples, right? You literally cannot enter, and I think that serves to majorly stop disrespect from happening. But secondly, let's actually address the sorts of tourists that's come to these places, right? Because if you are an allocentric tourist and you enjoy going to things and you probably don't care about cultures, and you want to go on the shot over jet, or you want to go bungee jumping, then that's probably something you're going to pursue. But if you come specifically to see a marae because that's probably less enjoyable to the average tourist, then that probably means that you're somebody who does care about these cultures and has this really exclusive interest and care for them. And that means you're always going to be so much more respectful, right? That's not the sort of tourist that does go and disrespects these cultures. And that means they're probably going to be really respectful. But thirdly, we would say that because the government is actively promoting this tourism under our side of the house, right? This means that the duty exclusively falls on them to ensure that these things are followed, right? This means that they do enforce those things, because if they don't, they get significant backlash if it's not respected. I'll explain more on this later. But what this means is that it is going to be respectful, which is necessarily a good thing. But I would say that this also probably clashes with the principle that it's really important to show and uplift cultures in a really positive way at all. And I think that's probably going to be the more important principle to preserve this culture than it was for it to be ethical. But secondly, on aestheticness, right? Firstly, I would say about how it's really bad when you just take photos for your Instagram. Firstly, I think the same thing applies, right? In terms of rules, there's probably certain rules that you can't take photos or touch certain sacred things. But secondly, here's really important. I think we flip this material, because if somebody does take a photo for the Instagram, it means that they take it home and they show it to their communities at home who probably had no other exposure of this Indigenous community. And that's really important, because now you're going through Instagram and you're seeing a whole new culture that you've never seen before. You're lifting them up on a platform and you're able to learn, and you're probably able to be more tolerant and learn more about this community that probably didn't happen under their side of the house. So I think that probably is a good thing. But I would say at the end of this point, though, principles essentially don't matter, because we told you what was the most important thing is providing some sort of financial gain to this community, because they are so disenfranchised and they're so disadvantaged. But secondly, if we are able to exclusively preserve their culture or do it more so than them, then we should also win that, because that's probably something that is really important to Indigenous people, more than an ethical thing, right? Why? Because the comparison is that they don't get either of those things on their side of the house, and that was probably something that was always going to be more tangibly beneficial to this Indigenous group. But secondly, now, who better protects these Indigenous groups is kind of a really vague clash, but it's sort of responding to their mechanisms. Firstly, on tokenism, right? I would firstly say that this is absolutely better than nothing, right? Even so far as maybe the name is misspelt, or people are mispronouncing the names of Māori leaders, that's probably so much better representation than none at all. Because if you do take it at their characterization, when they tell you how much these governments hate their Indigenous populations and they don't care about them, then we say there's probably absolutely no exposure or representation at all. And I think at least at that point in time, you have young Indigenous people able to still have some sort of be in touch with their heritage, and they're probably able to get money, even so far as you're betraying your culture because you're being a tokenistic person. You're probably still getting paid for that, and that's probably still something that's beneficial to you. Secondly, though, they told you that we don't address the issues under our side of the house because you're just using it like that. Firstly, I would say that you also do not address those issues under your side of the house, but secondly, we actually have far better scope to do so, because now you're educating it under our side of the house, and you're now informing so many more people of what actually happened there. And that's really important, because now it means that they're able to care more about those groups and vote on policies that are really important to them. Thirdly, though, They told you about like glorifying it and sweeping it under the rug. Firstly, I would say this probably it just isn't something that governments are able to get away with, right? Because there are so many people who are just informed about the history and they have learned about like the colonial history of things and what they want us to be. And what this means is that when you do go and like sweep things under the rug, you get an insane amount of backlash because you're literally like you're literally like standing for the exact same colonial things that are like that were so detrimental to these indigenous populations. And I think that this is something that most Western countries have tried so hard to get away from, right? They told you that you don't, right? I would say most simply do, because people have them, like there are so many people who are holding them account. But look, note here, what the comparison was is that essentially under their side of the house, they like sweep the entire culture under the rug altogether anyway. So even if we like did sweep like the bad parts of history under the rug, at least we still have like some parts of that culture being shown, because the comparison is that they get absolutely nothing, and that was an exclusive benefit to our side of the house. Before I like do the rest of mine, I'll take a PI.
Why is it then that governments such as Canada have gotten away with dirtying the waters of Native Americans in their states?
Right, but what's the comparison here is that under our side, we would now be like having people going and visiting these sacred sites and like going and like exploring that culture and understanding exactly what happened there. Under your side of the house, none of that happens, and they probably are able to get away with those things under their side. So much worse for you. Okay, let me flip your material about cultural appropriation and prove why this is probably a good thing to us. Lily told you in her setup that the government will get backlash if they like do appropriate these cultures. What this looks like is the government getting a lot of criticism from Indigenous cultures, extra scrutiny from media, like an iwi publishing a statement about how the government is misrepresenting them. Even if there is a degree of cultural appropriation, the government is a representative of all people, so it probably won't be bad. But this level of appropriation is also probably fine, because the comparison is that they're not shown at all internationally, which reduces the representation of this culture internationally. This does two things. Firstly, I would say that we'd rather have a slightly appropriated culture than none at all, because of a colonial government who has absolutely no incentive to preserve that culture. Because note, that was also an extra benefit that we had exclusively on our side of the house, that even so far as this like government was like incentives were completely corrupt, at least they're still having like some sort of like benefit because they're preserving Madais where Madais otherwise weren't getting preserved, right? But secondly, the other like thing is that nobody knows the stories of those things, and that was probably also incredibly harmful when you're like completely losing parts of history. But here's where we actually flip their benefit, right? Because when we tell you that a culture that is less seen in the mainstream is probably more likely to be misrepresented, particularly as like uncultured savages, right? And I think that's really harmful, because they're more likely to get far more cultural appropriation than us, because they're just like not being represented in the media at all. And at least under our side, we actually flip their benefit, and you do get more scrutiny under that and hold it to account. Finally, does the money get back to them? Look, I don't actually think that they gave us particularly good responses here, but I would say at the very surface level, it is probably not unethical to like sell out your culture, because that's actually something you have the autonomy to do. And because they told you so clearly that these are people that we care about because they've been like so disadvantaged economically, and that's actually completely in their right to do whatever it takes to like put food on their kids' table or like to put clothes on their kids' backs. And that was probably really important. We also just told you in general, like when we have like richer societies, because they've got more tourist dollars, they're probably also feeding through impacts at the point in time with those like governments that are paying reparations. I think at the end of that, we proved that like it's literally not unethical at the point in time where we exclusively preserve cultures and we exclusively provide financial benefits. That's all we needed to do to win the debate. We did both of those things. Incredibly proud to stand.
Hey, can you guys hear me? Perfect. So today we've won this debate if we can prove to you that it is morally and ethically wrong for the government, which has long repressed, slaughtered, and sought to destroy Indigenous cultures, to use those same cultures in tourism advertising. Now, firstly, I want to start off by addressing a massive false dichotomy, this completely false narrative that the opposing house has painted throughout this whole debate, which is either we accept some degree of misrepresentation, or our only alternative is no representation whatsoever. We think that this dichotomy doesn't fundamentally exist. Tourism is not the only way that we educate people about Māori cultures or Indigenous cultures in general. For that, we have our educational facilities, we have our educational institutions, right? If we want people to learn about Māori culture, we want them to learn about it with all the intricacies and all the nuance. Our best bet is to do that in schools. We want to teach kids throughout the school throughout their primary, intermediate, high school, and we want to teach them with the actual nuance, with the actual history of what took place. We want to facilitate this sort of learning in environments where it is more appropriate, right? Instead, when the New Zealand government runs ads for tourism and that sort of thing, right? Who are those going out to? New Zealand's largest international tourism markets are probably China, India, places like these, where we have a large number of tourists coming through. These people obviously are coming here for a good time. And this is where I think it's important to understand what the nature of tourism actually looks like. People that come to New Zealand, especially internationally as tourists, the nature of tourism is set up to give people a good experience, right? People come here, they want to have a good time, they want to have some fun. That's what they're spending money for, that's what they're coming here for. And so tourism obviously is an inappropriate avenue to try and educate people and to try and gain all the benefits that the opposing houses tried to portray in this debate. So essentially, the way tourism works is they're going to visit some sort of Māori heritage or site and that sort of place, maybe for a few hours at a time, right? And that experience is created to be as aesthetically appealing, as aesthetically wonderful. It's meant to make it look like it romanticizes the entire experience, right? It makes it look like this is some sort of new and unique and incredible world that these people have had no exposure to, right? And that fundamentally glosses over a lot of the history, a lot of the brutality that actually took place, right? It puts that under the rug, and essentially what it says is, oh, look, here's this fun tourist experience for you. You can come here and enjoy the food from the hangi, or that sort of thing, and just gloss over all the brutality and all the experiences that actually took place there. And so that's where we come to sort of this removing this false dichotomy. It's not we have either some degree of misrepresentation or no representation. What we're fighting for is representation in appropriate avenues in schools, in tertiary educational institutions, and places where people actually come to learn with all of the appropriate nuance, right? And that's where we come to, that's where we come to the first point of clash, right? Is it ethically inappropriate from an ethical perspective for the government to use Indigenous people and Indigenous cultures in their advertising? And so what we've tried to portray throughout this entire debate here is that there is a lot of bad history here that needs to be addressed. It can't just be that we're going to go into the same neighborhoods. Now, imagine if you were one of these people, right? Your parents or your grandparents were slaughtered. Your cultures were actively sought to be destroyed by this exact same government, the exact same institutions that just one generation ago were working against you, that you were fighting against, that your ancestors were dying against. There's no degree of glossing over that and saying that, well, it's the same institution that's going to walk into your homes, it's going to walk into your neighborhoods with a camera and tell you to smile and try and show you off your culture like it's doing. There's so much contentious. This is not just some sort of history. This is not something that happened in 2000 BC, right? These are people that have lived experiences, and these are people that are still being affected. We see that Indigenous cultures all over the world are still marginalized in many cases, often face low opportunities, often part of lower socioeconomic stratas. And for that reason, all this pain is still very real. It is still very present, and it is still caused by the exact same institution. The government is still very much involved in this. This is not history. This is the present. This is very much the present. And so it is very inappropriate for the government, who is also at the same time bolstering a lot of the institutions that work against Indigenous people. Perhaps even if you don't see that as much in New Zealand, you see it all over the world, right? For example, especially in North America, where the government has sequestered off specific reservations for Native Americans, and they give them almost no support, right? They give them sovereign areas where they're supposed to impose their own sense of government with no solid institutions, with no capital, with no investment, and essentially what you see is that these people succumb to a high rates of poverty, and that's the only option. So these governments that are receiving all this money from tourism, we would actively work to bolster the same institutions that in many parts of the world are still working to suppress and to subjugate these same cultures. This is not history. This is the present. These sorts of this legacy of tension, this legacy of brutality is still very much ongoing. And so we think it is very, very inappropriate for the same culture to turn around and say, oh, look at this beautiful culture. Oh, and by the way, we're actively working to destroy it at the same time. And so this brings me, before I proceed, I'll take a POI.
As you've hinged most of your cultural preservation point on education, what incentive does a government who hates their Indigenous people have to teach Indigenous history in education?
Well, I don't think you really need incentives to teach history. Your history is what it is, right? So New Zealand schools will teach New Zealand history. That's like saying, what incentive do schools have to teach math or English? Well, that's part of the curriculum. It's part of what's what a normally accepted curriculum in any part of the world would have. You wouldn't expect American schools not to teach American history. You wouldn't expect New Zealand schools not to teach New Zealand history. New Zealand history is fundamentally intertwined with Māori history. You can't teach New Zealand history without exploring the history of racial the history of race relations in this country, and so there's you don't really need an incentive to teach that. That's part of the educational infrastructure, right? So if the New Zealand government wants its citizens to be educated, it has no choice but to teach its own history, and so that idea is completely absurd. That the only way we have this sort of education take place is if we use them in our tourism ads, and if we don't run tourism ads, the government now has no incentive to teach its own history. And so this brings me to sort of the second point of class, which is, does it have a negative effect on the very same indigenous people that we've talked about throughout this debate? So we've heard a couple of points from the opposing house here, which is that governments would have an incentive to protect and preserve these indigenous cultures if they were making money for them. However, what we see here is that and sort of the tourism side of things is very disconnected from the reality, right? So it's the same governments. Yeah, sure, they might have an incentive to protect this sort of aesthetic program. They might have an incentive to protect some of the most money-making and most lucrative sides of the business, right? They want to protect. If we tie this to tourism revenue, then we turn it into a business. We turn it into a commercial opportunity, and that's exactly what we want to avoid. We don't want this to turn into, well, now the government is incentivized to protect what looks most aesthetically appealing. You know, what gets the most Chinese tourists to come to Rotorua? That's this aspect of New Zealand, which we're going to preserve. The rest of this culture, the rest of the Māori people who are living scattered across New Zealand, although often in poorer socioeconomic conditions, that it still creates no incentive for the government to help all these people. And so that benefit, even if we assume all of the things that the opposing house has said, the only benefit that they would even try and get in here is that we would preserve some sort of aesthetic tourist sites. And that's exactly what we don't want to be preserving, because it's very inappropriate. It's very inappropriate for the government, the same institution, to do this. It's exactly the same as if the Nazi government walked into some of the Jewish communities and said, oh, look, come visit Auschwitz or that sort of thing, right? We absolutely wouldn't want to do that, because we understand it would be inappropriate. We understand it would be ethically wrong. And we understand that there's a long embedded past filled with brutality, and that's something that we don't want to bring to the forefront of something that the government is trying to advertise. And so that's why we believe that this moot shall stand.
I'll just take my POIs in the chat, or you could make like a POI sign.
They've got one.
They've got a
POI sign.
Oh,
Yeah,
is it as good as ours?
It's pretty good. It's not
I
good.
don't know.
Quite good. This is quite nice.
That is pretty good. That's pretty
That's
good.
nice.
That's pretty good. That's better than any of the other teams. Like that, we've debated to that. Okay. I'm a McDonald's worker, so I'm about to flip your whole case. Okay, before I get into my three clashes, I'm just going to say that they came up here and they beautifully mentioned all the problems with colonialism, all the history of colonialism, all the problems that indigenous cultures have faced, but they necessarily lost this debate when they couldn't solve like any of these problems, right? Like, we think that we go far further to solving any of these problems, and that is why we win this debate. Firstly, just like a little bit about like the actual comparative in this debate, right? Like, it's not our burden to like, you know, solve all these colonial like reparations and stuff, but like, just to say, like, literally from first they told us that like these cultures will never be shown in like these ads, these indigenous cultures, and it's like what this just gives off is this like as if the government is trying to like literally actively hide their culture, right? Like, even showing it in some small degree is probably like more beneficial than just like not showing it at all. So like what this leads to is just like all of the government advertising is just like no money or representation that goes towards these indigenous people, right? Other than just like completely indirect. Whereas like us on our side of the house, like we've literally like, because it's like more towards indigenous people, right? Like a lot of money is like funneled to like these indigenous tourist operations, like as a consequence, because like people will, I don't know, people in the US will like see just like the Inuit Canadians like on the TV and will probably be like interested in learning about something that they've like never seen before, right? And like secondly, we also think that they're like shown like these people are like shown as like a valid and included part of the country. If you're hiding them, if you're not putting them in ads, what does that say about it? Okay, into the like three classes. Firstly, on like what is it more morally beneficial? I think this is like, even though this was the main case, I literally think we like flip this. Just because it's like the main sort of stuff here was like just some like well, I don't want to say buzzwords, but it was like saying that it's like degrading, disrespectful, and like unfair to show them in these ads, and it would like invoke trauma. Well, firstly, we think that like hiding their culture and like not showing it as part of like a valid part of the country is probably going to like provoke the trauma like way more, right? It's going to like tell them that like you're literally not a legitimate part of this country, right? Like that's the message that you're sending them if you're not putting them in these ads. But we also think like where we flip this is like the government is like, what this does by putting them in the ads is the government like actively reaching out to these indigenous groups. It shows them that they want to deal with these issues. It shows them that they want them to be an active part of this country. And at the very base level, it does a lot more to include them than the comparative does. And it's like not hiding away from their suffering. And it's like our side does like far more to like address these issues. But like, and even like if we don't get like any of the economic benefits that I'm going to talk about, like to these indigenous groups, we at least give like the appearance that we're trying to do this, at least to like other countries, whereas they're just like showing that they want to hide this. And like this sort of goes with like the aesthetic and like the selling themselves out for money, right? Well, like firstly, we think that like selling themselves out for money is probably better than like literally starving, right? Like if you are selling yourself out for money, like that's not. But we also think that like indigenous cultures like can do that if they want, right? Like we don't think this like moral principle thing necessarily applies if they want to, right? But also about the aesthetic, like again, look at the comparative, they're invisible on your side of the house. The only response there was like this extreme like comparison like James Charles, but we don't think that's all that relevant. So like overall, we think that like we actually deliver far more moral benefits. But like onto like the more like important stuff that I sort of like left later because I didn't really respond to it as much. Two main points here. They're like more concrete benefits. Like firstly about like money. Well, firstly on money, we think that like most indigenous like tourist ventures are run by indigenous people, right? Like we don't think the money is just going to go to the government. But we think that like, I don't know, if you take an example like a didgeridoo performance or something, then that's like probably just going to show like how people like it's probably showing tourists like how people like live like that, and like even if they don't like it, then it's probably just like all of this money like going towards these like people that like did this, right? But like even if like we don't get much money, even if like 99% of the money is funneled to the government, which it never will be, we still get more money due to like them like just not showing these ads, right? Like but just to like extend on this like even further, like why this is just like so necessarily debate winning, right? Because it looks like you get these like ads in the US like shown like blasted like of these like Canadian people. You get like hundreds more people going to like these indigenous sites. You get hundreds more people going to Nunavut. You get hundreds more people like, and that's just like a huge massive boost to these economies, right? This is going to look like a massive like, especially if they are like so bogged down by colonialism and they probably have like cycles of poverty. That's literally going to be able to like break them out of cycles of poverty. That's going to cause like a substantial increase in the standards of living of literally all of them. That means that they're able to like put food on the table. This is just such a profound benefit in this debate. And like we win this debate by like such a massive margin when we improve the lives of these people so substantially in this debate, when we manage to prove that they get like lots more of this money because the ads like mean that they're going to go to this tourist like place, right? Before I move on to my third class, I will take that on.
Okay, so how does it show that the government is trying to make reparations if they only want to show indigenous cultures when it profits the government financially, especially if the government has let these people starve in some of the richest countries in the world?
Well, I think firstly, like if they are literally run and owned by like indigenous groups, right? That is like one of the best ways that you are going to get like, money back into Indigenous people, right? That is like the government showing that they care, they want to actually get money into the Indigenous people's hands, right? And again, like what reparations you offering on the comparative? You're offering like nothing. You're offering them to be like literally invisible. Okay, onto like my third clash about like the representation. Okay, well, like the most legitimate thrust here was that like not everyone will respect it and there'll be like disrespectful like interactions. Well, firstly, we think that like generally that's probably only going to be like a few people, right? Like most people just like aren't racist, and the people that like generally pay all the money to go to like another country to or something to like go see these things are probably not going to just be like completely disrespectful. But we also think that like we probably flip this because if like the culture is like hidden on their side of the house, it's like far harder for them to like break down these stereotypes. It's like far harder for them to like engage with these Indigenous people because they're not as like represented in the mainstream, and therefore it's like because you're not getting this like culture as seen, right? You're probably going to be like see them more as like I don't know, savages, and that even necessarily applies when they are slightly misrepresented, like on our side of the house, because it still means that they're like going to be seen as like having a unique culture and having unique aspects to them. Okay, the other like push against representation was that there's education. Well, firstly, we think that there's like we can do that on our side of the house. Secondly, we think that like the government like if they hate minorities or Indigenous people, they're probably not just going to have the education. But thirdly, we actually think that we like flip this on our side of the house. We actually think this education, if it did exist, is probably going to be like far better on our side of the house because you're going to have like Māori that are more able to like invest in their maraes. You're going to have like which means that they're probably going to be like more able to like accurately convey what their culture actually looks like, and that probably means that they're going to be like more able to like actually like get across the message, and they're probably going to have like more developed tools for like teaching and like educating, which all comes along with like tourists when like these like Māori want to like develop their maraes for tourists so they can like easily understand, which like wouldn't happen on their side of the house. So therefore we think that like we get a far better benefits to like representation on our side of the house, and like so much better representation because they're like not invisible anymore. And that's why I think we win like all three like major points in this debate, and why I think we won. Thank you.
So here, I think we've proven pretty conclusively that ethical principles don't matter at the point in time where Indigenous populations are worse off under their side, right? Because Side F is literally trying to win the debate on having groups with absolutely no culture preserved and an extreme loss of identity, as well as significantly less money. But it's okay because at least they upheld the principle with absolutely no practical outcomes, right? I think we clearly won. If we need to call it the principle of like giving Indigenous groups a better situation, then like we completely fulfill that. Two questions to ask yourself at the end of today's debate. Firstly, who better upholds Indigenous culture, and secondly, who better provides them with like more money? Okay, who better upholds like Indigenous culture? Let's talk about two different sorts of countries that probably operate in this. One where they don't care about Indigenous culture and one where they do. Let's like deal with the one where they don't first because they spent like most of their time here. The comparison here is that no matter even if it is like probably quite bad representation, we're not really sure exactly what that looks like because they didn't actually tell us, but even if it was so harmful, the comparison here is that you're literally dealing with a country that does not care about their Indigenous population. And what that means is that you get none of the benefits that they talked about in terms of education because they have no incentive to like educate their population on that. But it also just means in general, they're probably not even like allowing maraes or like their like native Indigenous like buildings to even like exist in the first place, right? They probably have no like historical like reparations for them at all, and that means they're significantly worse off. And within that comparison, it means under our side we now at least have like a mid-eye for those people to go to, even so far it's like a really bad incentive to have it there because it was only profit oriented, then at least the indigenous population has access to that, and that was so exclusive to our side, so we clearly won in that world anyway. But look, one where this like country does care about this indigenous population, we think that they completely like that means none of their material about like disrespect or like aesthetic like harms stands at all, and we probably won that significantly because it means that these people who do go are really respectful and they do tell that full history, and what this means is you're like literally just getting the mass spread of culture internationally, and what that does is just completely restores it, right? And it allows so many more people to understand exactly like what it is and like share in that. So why is that exactly important? We told you this so clearly down our line because at like the worst, at least we're preserving the culture for our indigenous population that was so exclusive to our side of the house, because we now have this incentive for these governments to do it because they get their own financial gain from it. But secondly, we just share, spread, and reignite cultures, and what that looks like is literally just like forcing the reparation of like language after it was stolen during colonization, and that was always going to be such an exclusive benefit because now you have like people speaking their indigenous language because they're being tour guides. Even if the incentives for that are really bad, at least you still have that language, and that was what was going to win us the debate because that has really positive net benefits to those indigenous populations. Because why was culture important? Because it is literally the belonging for somebody. It is their place in the world. It is the understanding of their roots, and like forces us to not repeat the past, and it also just means that we're like in touch with our culture and like it's really good for our knowledge. So we clearly won that culture point, and that was clearly a really important point to win, and therefore we get credited a lot for that. But secondly, on money, right, we heard some pushbacks essentially that it was like just really unethical, but also that the money didn't go because we told you so many different like ways in which the money is beneficial. Firstly, because you're literally giving like money to the people who are running these like indigenous tourist operations. This looks like Māori-owned maraes, or like being able to like charge tourists for visiting, or like Aboriginal people like doing outback tours in Uluru, or like Native Americans selling moccasins. That was like always going to like provide that net gain, and that was really important because as both teams really like spent a lot of time setting up, we care about these indigenous people, and because they were so disenfranchised and so disadvantaged because of colonization, any net benefit in terms of money to them is going to go such a long way because this is literally like providing some form of reparation for them. But we also just told you that like they was always going to be so much better off in general when we provide like a much larger tourist market to a country in general. And we also just don't think that ethics mattered at the point in time where you're now having someone who was once very vulnerable able to put money on, able to put food on the table or clothes on the back. I think at the end of that we prove that we just significantly get more money because you're allowing these people to engage in tourist operations, which they literally do not let you do under their side, and they provide absolutely no way in which they were going to repair the culture that was exclusive to their side, or any way that they were going to provide financial benefit to them. So clearly we won today, today, incredibly proud to stand.
Am I muted? Oh no. Yeah, okay. Sweet. We tell you immediately that the negating team loses this debate when they grasp at straws and tell us that it's okay for indigenous groups to sell out their own culture in order to profit for the government, right? We tell you that indigenous groups selling out anything that they want to do, their own culture, in order to profit the government and to put food on their table, is an incredibly ethically wrong point. And we tell you that this is not something that is worth sacrificing at all in this debate. It's the most important thing in this debate, and that if you side negating, we tell you that you're okay with indigenous groups selling out in order to feed themselves, right? Two contentions in this debate. Firstly, who better protects the indigenous groups, and secondly, who generates better economic and ethic principles in this debate, right? We tell you immediately at with the first contention, right, that we tell you that a lot of contention, a lot of protections towards indigenous groups that the negating team has provided in this debate, such as preserving indigenous sites, such as creating interactions with indigenous groups, and that them being able to sell their food in order to generate profit. We tell you that this is inherently wrong as a principle when the government is using them as a tool and a weapon in order to maximize the profits that the government is having, right? We tell you that the government being able to profit off of these struggles that the indigenous groups are already creating is an inherently principally wrong point in this debate. We tell you that when you side with that, you just are ultimately saying that these people are only worth something when they generate profit towards New Zealand, right? Towards these governments, right? We tell you that on our side of the house, and this was implicitly stated at first F, explicitly stated at second F, and then once again explicitly stated at third neg, is that we would educate a lot of people within the groups, within their own individual countries, in the governments, in those individual states, in order to maximize the amount of education that's needed for these indigenous groups, right? We tell you that we better protect indigenous groups when the people of their own country actually know the struggles that's happening in this debate, right? We don't care if Chinese people know anything about Maori people. What weight does that have in the debate when your own people in your own country don't actually know anything that's happening with Maori culture, right? We tell you that we get these benefits on our side of the house, whereas they don't on their side of the house because the government is only prioritizing tourists and education for tourists, not the actual people in the individual country itself. They lose that principal point. They do not protect indigenous groups at all in this debate. Then what even if they say that there is no representation on our side of the house, that we get no marginal benefits for these indigenous groups, why is it then still inherently bad that the misrepresentation that the negating team presented in this debate is far off worse than no representation at all? We tell you already explicitly at first F, is this just an ethically wrong principle immediately when you want to prioritize and use an individual group in itself in order for a government to prioritize, right? We tell you that this is blatant tokenism and that when you tokenize something, you completely get rid of the entire meaning of that indigenous group, right? You completely whitewash it. You make it into something that is completely not what it originally was. And we tell you that this has inherent harms on the indigenous groups at all as a whole because of the fact that their culture that was trying to be preserved doesn't exist anymore. It's completely washed out of this debate. We tell you that the negating side is okay with whitewashing indigenous groups. So because this is the most important contention in this debate, we tell you that we've won this debate because we better protect indigenous groups, which we tell you already at our burden at first F. So then moving on to the second contention, who generates better tourism? We tell you that this is just a margin extending point of clash, not really important, but we tell you that even if the side negating wins this point, we tell you that the ethical principles are more important in this debate and that generating better tourism and manipulating the indigenous groups in order to profit off of something is an inherently wrong thing, and that is why side affirming rests their case.